At 10:07 on the morning of June 19th, 1944, a fighter direction officer sat in a darkened room aboard the USS Lexington. On his radar screen, green phosphorescent blips crawled 130 miles west of his position. 69 Japanese aircraft were heading straight toward Task Force 58. The screen showed everything: the enemy formation, the American carriers, and the empty ocean between them. In the next 12 minutes, fighter directors across the task force would have to coordinate the interception of those 69 enemy aircraft using dozens of Grumman F6F Hellcat fighters. The Americans possessed something the Japanese didn't know existed: a technological advantage so complete that what happened in the next 17 minutes would change naval warfare forever. Japanese pilots launched from 9 carriers that morning, believing they were flying conventional strike missions against the American fleet. Vice Admiral Haizaburo Ozawa's first wave consisted of 69 aircraft, a mix of fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes. The plan was simple: fly to the American carriers, attack from altitude, sink as many as possible. Japan needed to destroy at least 5 of America's 15 carriers to shift the balance. Japanese pilots knew American aircraft were tough and their pilots skilled, but they believed they would see American fighters coming. They were tragically wrong. At that exact moment, every movement their formation made was being tracked by an SK-2 air search radar aboard the battleship Alabama, detected at 150 miles range. It was plotted on transparent vertical boards in multiple combat information centers across the task force, and analyzed by teams of radar operators, plotters, and fighter directors who were preparing to vector American fighters to intercept the formation before it came anywhere near the carriers. Earlier that morning, a moment of extraordinary heroism had offered the Japanese fleet a temporary reprieve. Warrant Officer Sakio Komatsu, a Japanese pilot who had just taken off, saw the wake of an American torpedo streaking toward his carrier, Taiho. He broke formation, dove his aircraft into the path of the torpedo, and deliberately crashed into it. Komatsu died instantly, destroying 1 torpedo, but 5 others continued. For missed, but the 6th struck Taiho, rupturing fuel tanks. Damage seemed minor, but ruptured fuel lines were filling the ship with explosive vapors. Komatsu's heroism had delayed the inevitable by hours, not prevented it. The first major test of American radar-directed fighter defense had come just days before, on June 11, 1944. Task Force 58 launched a massive strike against Saipan. Japanese pilots trying to intercept found American Hellcats waiting at precise altitudes and headings. Not by chance, not by luck, but by radar detection and coordinated vector assignments. Japanese pilots reported that American fighters appeared from nowhere, perfectly positioned. Their commanders assumed it was coincidence. They were wrong. The Americans were tracking every Japanese aircraft from the moment it took off. 4 days later, on June 15th, 7 Japanese torpedo aircraft attacked from Guam. American radar detected them at 80 miles. Fighter directors vectored Hellcats to intercept. 6 of the 7 were shot down before reaching the carriers. The 7th turned back. 0 hits on American ships. Japanese intelligence couldn't explain how Hellcats had simply materialized, perfectly positioned. What the Japanese didn't understand was that they were no longer fighting individual pilots. They were fighting a system. By mid-June 1944, the Combat Information Center, or CIC, had become the nerve center of American carrier operations. The concept evolved from hard lessons learned in 1942. At the Battle of Midway, American carriers had fought almost blind. Radar existed but was primitive. Communication was chaotic. Fighter direction happened by guesswork. After Midway, the Navy knew it needed something better. Admiral Chester Nimitz's staff studied British experiences, analyzed radio failures, and designed new procedures. In November 1942, standardized fighter direction procedures were issued. By early 1944, every new carrier had a dedicated CIC space with trained operators. The system worked through integration. Multiple ships, equipped with SK-2 air search radars, detected incoming raids at ranges up to 150 miles. Radar returns appeared on circular scopes with rotating sweep lines. Operators called out range and bearing. Enlisted plotters marked these contacts on large, transparent vertical plotting boards using grease pencils. Enemy aircraft, friendly fighters, surface ships, all on one display visible to everyone in the CIC. The fighter direction officer stood behind the plotters, watching the entire tactical picture develop in real time. He had clear, reliable VHF radio communication with every Hellcat in the air. He could see the fighters on the plot, he could see the incoming raid, he could calculate intercept courses, altitudes, and timing. Then he would pick up the radio microphone and vector the fighters into position. Turn left heading 270. Climb to Angels 18. Bogey bearing 295. Range 60 miles. The fighters would acknowledge and maneuver. The plot would update. The intercept would develop, and the Japanese would fly straight into a carefully positioned trap without ever knowing it existed. The problem wasn't that Japanese pilots didn't know what to do. They knew. Japanese naval aviation doctrine emphasized attacking from altitude, using speed, coordinating strikes. The doctrine was sound. The tactics had worked for 2 years. But doctrine assumed both sides were fighting blind. It assumed you could approach undetected until visual range. It assumed enemy combat air patrol would be randomly positioned. All those assumptions had been true in 1942 at Coral Sea, Midway, and Santa Cruz. Japanese formations had approached American carriers and fought their way through combat air patrols positioned by guesswork. Sometimes they got through. By June 1944, those assumptions were obsolete. The Americans weren't guessing anymore. They were tracking. They were calculating. They were vectoring. And Japanese pilots were flying into precisely coordinated interceptions without understanding why. On the morning of June 19th, Ozawa launched 4 massive strikes against Task Force 58. He commanded 9 aircraft carriers and 430 aircraft, expecting support from 300 land-based planes. He believed he had numerical advantage and superior range. What Ozawa didn't know was that American submarines had already spotted his fleet, and American intelligence had broken Japanese operational codes. Admiral Raymond Spruance knew Ozawa was coming. Admiral Marc Mitscher, commanding Task Force 58, prepared a coordinated defense that would destroy Japanese naval aviation in a single day. At 10 a.m. on June 19th, the first major raid appeared on radar screens. 69 aircraft 150 miles out, bearing west. Fighter directors designated it Raid 1. The task force fighter director aboard the Lexington coordinated with task group fighter directors across the fleet. Multiple carriers prepared to launch every available fighter. The system, developed over 2 years, refined through combat experience and perfected through training, was about to face its greatest test. The fighter direction officer in the Lexington CIC watched the plot. Hellcats were already airborne, more were launching. The fighter directors needed to position them 70 miles west at 18,000 feet to catch the Japanese at altitude. Radio calls went out. Standby 25. Turn right heading 280. Climb to Angels 18. The plot showed the Hellcats converging. At 70 miles range, the lead Hellcat division reported visual contact. Bandits high 12 o'clock, large formation. The fighter director gave the command, "Tally-ho, execute." The Hellcats dove in. They hit the Japanese formation from above and ahead. Perfect position. The Japanese never saw them coming until Hellcats were in their midst. Zeros tried to engage, but it was too late. The Hellcats scattered the formation. More American fighters arrived from other vectors, precisely where fighter directors had positioned them. The Japanese formation disintegrated. Individual aircraft tried to press attacks toward the carriers, only to be pursued and destroyed one by one. Anti-aircraft fire from screening battleships and cruisers created a wall of explosions. Japanese aircraft that penetrated the Hellcat screen flew into that wall. Very few survived. By 10:40 a.m., the engagement was over. 42 of 69 Japanese aircraft destroyed. 27 turned back or scattered. 0 hits on American carriers. 1 Hellcat shot down. Its pilot recovered. At 11:07 a.m., radar detected Raid 2. 109 aircraft, larger than Raid 1, coming from the northwest. Range 120 miles. The task force fighter director assigned intercepts. The system repeated. Hellcats, already airborne from Raid 1, reformed and repositioned. Raid 2 approached, maintaining formation discipline as doctrine prescribed. But doctrine assumed the enemy was blind. The Hellcats hit them 60 miles out. 70 Japanese aircraft destroyed before the raid reached the American task force. The remainder scattered. 4 attacked the carriers but near misses. All 4 were shot down. The second raid had been annihilated with even greater efficiency. The third raid came at 1 p.m., 47 aircraft from the north. Same pattern. Detection, plotting, vectors, intercept. 7 Japanese aircraft were shot down in the initial contact. The rest turned back without pressing the attack. Japanese pilots were beginning to understand they were flying into a trap they couldn't see and couldn't counter. But they had no way to communicate the nature of that trap to commanders who didn't understand radar-directed fighter control. The fourth raid, 82 aircraft, launched later but couldn't locate the American fleet. They circled, searched, burning fuel. Navigation errors compounded by combat stress. Fighter directors detected them on radar heading toward Guam to land and refuel. Hellcats were vectored to intercept them over a roady field. 27 American fighters arrived as the Japanese were circling to land, fuel low, defenses down, completely vulnerable. The American fighters tore into them. 30 Japanese aircraft were shot down over the field. 19 landed but were damaged by strafing runs. 0 effective aircraft remained from that raid. By 4 p.m., June 19th, the battle was over. Japanese losses exceeded 346 carrier aircraft destroyed. American losses were just 30 aircraft. The statistical disparity was unprecedented. Japanese naval aviation had suffered a defeat so complete that it would never recover. The carrier force that had attacked Pearl Harbor, that had terrorized the Pacific for 2 years, was effectively finished. This wasn't because American pilots were better trained, though they were. It wasn't because American aircraft were superior, though they were. It was because the Americans had built a system that integrated radar detection, coordinated communication, and precise fighter direction into a seamless defensive network that Japanese pilots couldn't penetrate and Japanese commanders couldn't understand. Japanese pilots had launched that morning believing they were attacking an enemy who fought the same way they did. Visual sighting, individual initiative, pilot skill against pilot skill. Instead, they had encountered something completely different. A coordinated defense system that saw them coming from 150 miles away, calculated their course and altitude with mathematical precision, positioned interceptors perfectly, and destroyed them in carefully orchestrated engagements that left no room for individual skill to compensate. It wasn't a fair fight. It was systematic execution. What the Japanese pilots didn't see was the Combat Information Center. They didn't see the radar operators watching green blips on circular screens. They didn't see the enlisted plotters marking transparent boards with grease pencils. They didn't see the fighter directors with radio microphones issuing comm vectors to Hellcat pilots. They didn't see teams of sailors working together with rehearsed precision. They only saw the result. Hellcats appearing from perfect positions every single time. No matter how they maneuvered, no matter how they approached, the Americans were always ready, always positioned, always waiting. Japanese pilots reported this to their commanders. The Americans must have new radar. They must have broken our codes. While both were partially true, those weren't the decisive factors. The decisive factor was integration. The Americans had taken detection technology, communication systems, plotting techniques, and fighter direction doctrine and integrated them into a coordinated system that functioned as a single weapon. The Japanese had most of the same components: radar, radio communication, skilled pilots. What they lacked was integration. Japanese carriers operated independently, each tracking its own radar contacts and directing its own fighters. There was no unified picture, no coordinated vectors, no systematic approach. Japanese fighter direction remained intuitive and individual rather than systematic and coordinated. By the time Japanese engineers understood what the Americans had built, it was too late to respond. The industrial capacity and trained personnel didn't exist. The Battle of the Philippine Sea demonstrated conclusively that modern warfare had entered a new era. Technology alone didn't determine victory. What mattered was integration. The ability to combine multiple technologies and procedures into a coordinated system, the willingness to train personnel systematically, and the institutional discipline to follow procedures under stress. These factors, more than any individual weapon or tactic, determined the outcome. After the war, the Combat Information Center concept became standard on every American warship, evolving into modern naval air defense networks like the Aegis system. The underlying concept remained identical: integrate detection, coordination, and execution into a seamless system. Those nameless officers and enlisted personnel in the CICs, working with grease pencils and glowing radar scopes, received no individual recognition, their work kept secret. Yet, their contribution was as significant as any combat pilot. They proved that modern warfare required new types of warriors, not just brave men willing to face danger, but technically trained personnel who could operate complex systems under stress. The submarine war that morning had already dealt devastating blows. Despite Komatsu's heroism, a spark later ignited the aviation fuel vapors on Taiho. She exploded and sank with 1,650 crew. USS Kavala also fired torpedoes at the carrier Shokaku, a veteran of Pearl Harbor and Midway. 3 torpedoes struck, igniting catastrophic fires. Shokaku, too, exploded and sank, taking 887 crew. The loss of 2 fleet carriers compounded the disaster of losing 346 aircraft. Japan had started the war with 3,500 highly trained carrier pilots. By June 1944, fewer than 1,000 experienced pilots remained. The Battle of the Philippine Sea destroyed what was left of Japan's experienced pilot corps. On June 20th, American forces went on the offensive. Admiral Mitscher launched strikes against the retreating Japanese fleet, pushing Hellcats to the limit of their range. Facing pilots returning in darkness with minimal fuel, Mitscher made a controversial decision. He ordered every ship in Task Force 58 to turn on its lights. This made the fleet a target, but Mitscher believed saving pilots mattered more than blackout discipline. Most pilots found carriers and landed safely. American destroyers plucked dozens of aviators from the water, showcasing a systematic combat search and rescue as effective as their air defense. The Battle of the Philippine Sea ended Japanese hopes of defeating the American advance through naval aviation. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo resigned less than a month later. The strategic bombing campaign against Japan from the captured Marianas bases became possible. The technological lessons influenced naval warfare for decades. The principles demonstrated on June 19, 1944, seeing the battlefield clearly, coordinating forces effectively, executing actions systematically, remain fundamental to military success today. The Japanese had courage. They had training. They had skill. What they didn't have was a system that could compete with American radar-directed fighter control. And on June 19, 1944, that deficiency cost them 346 aircraft and decisively shaped the war in the Pacific. It's the hardest lesson of modern warfare. Courage doesn't matter if you're fighting the wrong kind of fight. Training doesn't matter if your doctrine is obsolete. Skill doesn't matter if the enemy can see you coming and position forces to counter your every move. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. And we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans the globe. Thank you for watching and thank you for keeping these stories alive. Make sure MK130 images prompt take time and make perfect prompts, not 33.